Hello everyone, and welcome back to another one of my wellness presentations. Today I want to talk about the art of storytelling. Storytelling is an ancient and critical component in the tale of humanity. Storytelling is arguably the most powerful leadership capability in regards to enacting change on a widespread cultural level. I call storytelling an art because, as with all arts, individuals can utilize many different paths to become impactful. History's most successful leaders brandished a variety of storytelling methods to communicate their messages. On an individual level, each day all of us use stories to paint our reality, to influence others, and most basically to survive. Today we will explore the history of storytelling, diagnose the components of storytelling, examine the greatest storytellers of all time, and demonstrate how you can better comprehend the stories being told to you each day. When was the first story told on Earth? Well, we do not have the exact answer to this, but most likely it was by cavemen. We know that cavemen have made magnificent drawings all around the world for at least 50,000 years. We are just now coming to understand that there are actually patterns to these drawings. These patterns traverse thousands of miles and thousands of years. The patterns hint towards an aspect of storytelling. If the drawings were just simple recreations of something that cavemen were looking at the time, we would not see such definite patterns. Most likely these patterns were used to communicate stories within tribes and even externally to other tribes. We also know that early man had an amazing capability to recall information presented to them orally, as this was the main form of communication. Studies done on indigenous tribes suspect that the passing of oral stories is 90% completely identical. There is a possibility that even before the cavemen told stories by drawing them on the walls of caves, they told stories orally, which may have been passed down identically through many generations. One of the most commonly held first stories that we have evidence of is the Epic of Gilgamesh. This is a poem written in Sumerian cuneiform language on a tablet that has survived 4,000 years. The story has many life lessons presented, not the least of which is man's search for eternal life. Later, the development of Egyptian hieroglyphics allowed for the construction of more detailed stories, especially for the royal class. I wanted to talk about the history of storytelling to demonstrate how anciently important storytelling has been for humanity. However, new studies show that storytelling is important for even more than humanity, even for animals. The main characteristics of storytelling are what, where, and when. And studies on animals show that they're able to tell some stories using these components. So let's talk about the birds, the bees, and an ape. In a laboratory setting, researchers presented scrub jays with two different types of food, one perishable, one non-perishable. They found that the birds vastly preferred to eat the perishable variety. Researchers then gave the birds the same two food choices within larger enclosures. The jays took the food and cached them in various locations. Once done hiding the food, the birds were removed from the enclosure and kept out for various durations of time. When released back into the enclosure, the researchers found that the majority of birds would choose to recover and eat the preferred perishable food if released back into the enclosure in less than 28 hours. But the jays would recover and eat the less preferred non-perishable food if they were kept out of the enclosure for more than 28 hours. This shows that scrub jays can recall where the food is hidden, what type of food are hidden, and when the foods are originally hidden. These actions satisfy the three staples of narrative storytelling. In addition, studies show that bees, after going out and getting pollen, will come back and communicate with each other through dance. They have a variety of dance patterns that tell the bees where the pollen was found, how they like the pollen, and when and how long it would take to get to the pollen and back from the pollen. And we don't know how they come to a decision, but the bees somehow come to a decision after all coming back and dancing with each other to systematically go out and find that pollen. So again, they are going through all of the characteristics of narrative storytelling, what the pollen, where it is, and when and how long it takes to get to it. Finally, in one study, a language-trained chimpanzee observed a caretaker hiding a food beyond the fence of an enclosure, out of the reach of the chimp. 16 hours later, the chimp recruited a different caretaker who did not know where the food had been hidden, indicated the kind of food that was hidden, and directed the caretaker to the food itself. So again, satisfying those three characteristics. The importance of storytelling is in a long history of humanity, but also throughout some animals. When we realize that storytelling is interwoven through all of this parts of life, we need to start understanding and comprehending the principles of storytelling so that we can become better storytellers and we can analyze stories better. The 4 principles of good storytelling are characters, context, conflict, and creativity. The characters are the protagonists versus the antagonists. These are not always people. It's usually something that represents the good side versus the evil side, and good versus evil could be a ship versus the high seas. It could be technology versus sustainability in an article in a journal. Good storytellers develop great characters. They help you to see into the weaknesses of your protagonists and often make you feel connections to the antagonists as well. Pure good versus pure evil isn't the world we live in. There are shades of gray, and good storytellers use these shades of gray to connect their characters to their audience. There are 2 types of context when telling a story. There's internal context and there's external context. The internal context is the actual time and place, the when and the where of the story that you're telling. Internal context sets the stage for characters to be introduced to the conflict. External context is your audience and your medium about going to reach that audience. Knowing your audience is critical as it affects the ways in which you use the internal context to draw them into your story. But it also affects what medium you use to make sure you maximize that audience. Conflict is the third aspect of good storytelling, and it's usually taken too literally. If I am telling a story about a big test that I took, even if I did very well and it seems like a happy story, the conflict may lie in the study and preparation that it took. It isn't necessarily negative, but it was what the character had to overcome to achieve the goal. When telling a good story, your climax is at the top of your building conflict, and then there's some falling action resolution to the story after the climax. The climax traditionally comes towards the end of the story, but this is not always the case. There are stories that have their climax near the beginning, and the rest of the story is about the character's resolution to that climax. It's also hard to define a specific climax in some well-crafted stories. For example, storytelling experts still argue whether the climax of Romeo and Juliet was when Romeo kills Tybalt or when Romeo takes the poison. And probably the most important part of storytelling is creativity. There are many different methods of creativity. You can change the style and the pace, your consistency, your tone, your clarity. Some authors are specifically unclear to tell a story, right? To allow the reader to come to their own assumptions. Some are trying to persuade the reader and very specific and consistent. So there are many different methods in which master storytellers use to creatively spin their stories. Let's diagnose one of the most famous storytellers alive today and see some of the examples of creative storytelling. I know as soon as you put a President Donald Trump example into a video that a lot of emotions get high. I'm not here to be either a proponent or opponent to President Trump. However, I would like to diagnose his storytelling capability. Let's just go through one of his tweets and talk about the principles of good storytelling as we go through this tweet. So remember, the first principle of good storytelling is characters. So the tweet says, absentee ballots are fine. A person has to go through a process to get and use them. Mail-in voting, on the other hand, will lead to the most corrupt election in the United States history. Bad things happen with mail-ins. Just look at special election in Paterson, New Jersey. 19% of ballots are fraud. Again, we're not going to talk about the claims or anything like this. We're going to talk about the story. Okay? So the characters in this story, I would argue that there's an implicit and explicit meaning to this, and I will go over both. The explicit characters in this story are the absentee ballots versus the mail-in ballots, right? So he's making a distinction, giving them both their definitions, and basically taking sides on one, giving one the designation of the protagonist. That would be the absentee ballots that he affirms, and then the mail-in ballots are the protagonists, in which he disaffirms. The next part we want to talk about is the internal context. So what are the contexts here? The context is voting has started, right? And voting is starting very close to the presidential election, so voting is very important on his mind. He's trying to get reelected. So that the timing of that, the setting of that, the place of this, he's giving examples of New Jersey, right, and trying to claim fraudulent activity there, and giving you a connection between that and one of his protagonist characters, the mail-in voting, essentially. So I would argue that that is the internal context. Now, the external context, as far as his audience, right? The audience and medium in this one go extremely hand in hand. So his audience are his election base and the people that he's trying to get to swing towards his side. So he obviously has a good base that he's trying to keep, but he's also trying to prove to the people in the middle, hey, there's a lot of stuff going on here. I want you to come out to the polls, or I want you to do absentee ballots, and we should not be using these mail-in ballots, right? So his audience are those people who are interested in that. His medium here, that's the most interesting part, is Twitter. President Trump is famous for being obsessed with Twitter. He is posting 10, 20 times a day, reposting, using it as almost as a reality show to keep his audience engaged. He knows this is his number one way of getting information out. He has 82 million followers. Plenty of those people are not positive followers, but still he knows that this medium is important. And also it changes the way that he creatively, if we move into some creative tones here, goes about telling stories, right? Because he has the 160 character limit. So being and on top of that, with the news cycle the way it is, because he knows that these tweets get picked up in the news cycle, in which most people only see flashes of the news on Instagram. They see flashes of the news on YouTube. Most people don't sit down and watch diagnosis. So he knows that he's trying to put out bursts in there. He's trying to figure out what verses are going to get clipped from this, right? So he pretty much sits down in one tweet and is able to put a versus absentee versus mail-in voting, right? And then he's say, here's your example, and then he picks one number to make it point to why mail-in voting is bad, right? So there's plenty of stuff he leaves out, but because of the way storytelling has adapted to become in this new on-demand, immediate type of culture, he has also adapted as a storyteller. And this is part of the reason that he has such a powerful following, whether you like him or not. He has adapted to a very contemporary style of storytelling, and he's done that in a very creative manner. And I think the conflict here is pretty obvious. Mail-in voting is significantly worse than absentee voting. In general, he's not a fan of mail-in voting, so he's trying to point out these things to get the mail-in voting to either stop or be minimalized as much as possible. So he's pointing out that conflict pretty obviously. Now, I would also argue that I mentioned this is the explicit storytelling, but there is an implicit story going on behind the scenes with this story being told, because these characters also represent Trump himself, right? So Trump has been petitioning, or not petitioning, but at least portraying himself as always being the one being taken advantage of, right? He's the one that the other side is going to have voter fraud, or the other side is corrupt and the crooked Hillary. So this is also another part of his storytelling that he does better than anyone else in America right now, I would argue. And I think he learned this from the reality TV shows that he put on, is the branding. So because, again, we don't have a lot of extensive research into people and things like that, he brands people with names and slogans right off the bat, and he keeps going at him, and that's what he's doing here. He's branding himself as the president that people are going to vote for, and that the mail-in votes, any way that votes are higher, or because he didn't have the actual people come out and vote. So I think there's an implicit kind of thing behind the scenes here where he's trying to set up the conflict between him and any reason that his voting numbers aren't as high. Regardless of whether you are for Donald Trump or against Donald Trump, it's still very important to be able to look at the things he says and analyze them, right? So, I mean, he's the President of the United States, so regardless of whether you like that or not, he says a lot of important things, and he makes a lot of important decisions that affect people's life. And the story that he wants you to believe, it may or may not be what's really going on. And so it's important to look at and understand, okay, in this certain circumstance, he has very little time. What is he doing to paint everything certain ways? And then, once you understand the way that he's painting things, going out and researching and understanding the ways that other people paint them, and trying to figure out what reality is in the middle, because that's really what it comes down to, is that you got a lot of people picking and choosing to create their own stories out of a reality that is, again, in a lot of gray, muddy water.